Hello and welcome to the latest edition of PowerTalk, a series of interviews which we conduct with the foremost strategic affairs experts in India on a wide range of subjects ranging from geopolitics, Indian foreign policy, and some of the latest developments around the world. Our guest for today is Commodore Uday Bhaskar. Commodore Bhaskar is a distinguished naval officer with a service career of over 37 years in the Indian Navy. He's also a renowned strategic affairs expert who served as the director of IDSA as well as the director of the National Maritime Foundation, both of which are two leading think tanks in India. He's also been associated with various other institutes such as IPCS as well as the Indian Council of World Affairs. Thank you so much, Commodore Bhaskar, for being with us here today. I'm going to jump straight away into the South China Sea, a naval theater with which I'm sure you're intimately acquainted. There have been various concerns which have been expressed by strategic affairs experts such as you, suggesting that we need to be worried about increasing Chinese assertiveness and military adventurism, if I might say, in the South China Sea. We've had China bullying smaller nations by building artificial islands, standoffs with naval vessels, including those of India as well as those such as Philippines and Vietnam, occupying shoals, rocks, as well as small islands, such as what happened with Scarborough Shoal and Mischief Reef, and various other measures that the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard has been taking in the region, slowly capturing more territory. Is this a cause for concern, or is this something which has been blown up by the Indian media and the strategic affairs community?
As far as the region is concerned, meaning the Southeast Asian ASEAN region, and by extension East Asia, which is about China and Japan, there is a fair amount of concern. Over the last 5 to 6 years, many of the Chinese actions in relation to what they describe as the 9-dash line, which is the basis for the various maritime claims that they are making, have been contested. But notwithstanding the protests of whether it's a Vietnam or a Philippines, we have seen what might be described as creeping assertiveness on the part of China and the Chinese Navy. And they have also now created what again might best be described as artificial islands to buttress their claims. And the net result really is that the waters in the region, if you will, the South China Sea, are currently roiled. And India has also expressed its view on the subject, meaning that India is not a direct stakeholder in as much as, say, Vietnam and Philippines, and there are extended claims as far as Brunei, Indonesia and the others are concerned. But there's just one point, India and China have never really had a face-off in terms of naval vessels as far as the region is concerned, because A, it is not an area that India maintains any kind of presence. We do not have any vital economic interests as of now that are either being challenged or threatened by China's actions. And while there have been some media reports about Indian naval ships ostensibly being challenged by various entities that were related to the Chinese government or the Chinese Navy, my own sense is that when this was brought up officially, the Chinese distanced themselves and said that this was some kind of autonomous actor. There was some radio, shall we say, inputs that had been received where some warnings were issued. This happened at a time when one of our landing ships was transiting the South China Seas as part of a routine, but not a patrol so much as they were doing a deployment, towards Japan. And it was at that time that this particular incident had happened. So I think it would not be totally accurate to say that there has been a standoff between India and China in the naval domain in the South China Sea. But yes, India has expressed a fairly, I would say, unambiguous view about the need to ensure the freedom of navigation and to respect customary law, and something that many countries have said, that if there is a disputed territorial claim that more than one country has, that it has to be resolved within the ambit of appropriate law and whatever be the political consultations between the parties that are involved. Now, this interestingly found reflection even in the India-US statement when President Obama had visited India in January of 2015.
The INS Airawat, I think that you were talking about, the ship which you claim the whole incident was overblown. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about what you spoke about, which is that India doesn't have direct stakes in the region. I mean, I would argue, for example, that India does have direct stakes in the region, specifically in terms of the hydrocarbons. I mean, both India and China are always on the lookout for greater energy, and we do have oil blocks which have been awarded to us. I think oil block 127 and 128, which are awarded by Vietnam, as well as other great potential resources of hydrocarbons in the area. So would it be incorrect to characterize it as a situation in which India doesn't have any direct interests? And my second question was, about what you mentioned, that there have been unambiguous statements which have been made by Indian political leaders. That's a little confusing, because personally I feel that there have been ambiguous statements which have been made in the past. You had the former naval chief, Admiral Joshi, who mentioned 2 years ago that India would use force if necessary to protect its interests in the region. This is a little different from what the previous naval chief, Admiral Verma, said I think a year before Admiral Joshi, that India does not foresee the use of force in the region at all. And there's been some ambiguity even in statements made by the political leadership. For example, you had the previous administration's Foreign Minister Salman Khurshid, who happened to note that India will not be intervening in the South China Sea dispute, whereas both Prime Ministers, Manmohan Singh as well as Prime Minister Modi, have made forceful statements at summits such as that of ASEAN, where we have said that India strongly approves of the use of international law, the law of the sea, and so on and so forth, international principles to solve the dispute. And this was, as you pointed out, backed up by the Indo-US joint statement which Modi and Obama signed. So is there some ambiguity given the different signals that have come out from military leaders as well as political leaders?
Well, first of all, I think let me sort of restate this. India does have economic interests in the entire East Asian seaboard. It's not that we do not have, and these are very significant economic and trade interests, meaning that if you look at India's export-import, there is a fair amount of merchant cargo that is transiting the entire East Asian seaboard through the Malaccas, through the South China Seas, and going all the way up to the Koreas and Japan. This is a significant component, as I said, of India's overall trade. So to that extent, there is an interest. My point is that specific to the South China Sea, where there is a territorial dispute, and yes, we did have an oil asset by way of what the Videsh had done, ONGC Videsh. But my larger observation is that these interests have not been directly affected or challenged by China's actions. That is the broader point, meaning that nobody is threatening the trade as of now. So therefore, there is what you might call as a larger ambiance of stability as far as the East Asian seaboard is concerned, barring the incidents of piracy, which every country deals with, in the most appropriate manner. The real point of contention came up when China had protested about India's hydrocarbon exploration, which were awarded to India, as you pointed out, by Vietnam, saying that this is in disputed waters. And at that time, the Indian position, which I believe is a fairly valid and logical position, was that India had entered into a bilateral with Vietnam. If China has a problem, it should resolve it with Vietnam, not with India. So that's how India approached it. As it happens, the hydrocarbons, the exploration has not been so significant. The kind of possibility that there would be large amounts of hydrocarbons to be extracted was not borne out. So for India, even now, it's a relatively dormant kind of interest at this point in time. But it's the principle, I think, which India has endorsed at the political and diplomatic level, which is in consonance with what the United States and various other countries, frankly, everybody, barring one or two ASEAN states that have now, for whatever reason, chosen to take China's side, have expressed their concern about China's what I call as the creeping assertiveness. Now, both the chiefs that you mentioned, Admiral Verma and Admiral Joshi, yes, they have made these statements, and in a way, I think they do cover what you might call as the spectrum of Indian positions. What Admiral Joshi has said, I would interpret it as an extension of what I was earlier making the point, that India does have economic interests. And if I remember right, Admiral Joshi at that time had said that if the government feels or the country feels that there is an interest over there that needs to be either protected or looked after, then the Indian Navy would be the logical instrument. And therefore, we cannot be oblivious to what is happening in those waters. But there is a flip side, which is what was stated by Admiral Nirmal Verma, which is to say that India at this point is not looking at the South China Sea as an area of high operational priority. There are two reasons for this. One, as I said, it is not our backwater. India does not have a specific stake as far as the contestation of the territorial disputes are concerned in the SCS. And India does not have the capacity either. So I think we should also, while there is a principle that India is upholding in a political and diplomatic context, I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that India does not have assets at this point or the capacity to maintain what you might call as a certain naval presence, because the objective is also not clear. It does not make sense for India to get into this when there is no direct interest that's being affected. Yes, you made the point politically, diplomatically, and concurrently, until you acquire appropriate capacity in the event that there is a need to deploy it, I would say that it is more prudent for India to be monitoring, to be very, very aware of what is happening, and to consolidate your naval capacity, because the Indian Ocean itself represents another very, very complex arena where we will have to deal with both Chinese presence as also other challenges that may emerge as far as the extended IOR or the Indian Ocean region is concerned.
I want to get back to the Indian Ocean a little later and stick with the entire South China Sea angle for a while. You spoke about principles and you spoke about the need for India and the other countries in the region, including the US and some of the other ASEAN countries, to uphold the principles of international law and to express that the principles of international law need to be upheld by all the countries in the region. But is there any point in upholding these principles or arguing for the upholding of these principles if these principles are being continuously undermined by China? So you have China, we're talking about the law of the sea, which is a law governing the use of the water resources of the region. But what China is doing is continuously creeping forward and occupying more and more land territory, whether it's through artificial islands, whether it's through actually capturing islands, like I mentioned, Scarborough Shoal and Mischief Reef. But China is slowly creeping forward, capturing more and more territory. And as it does so, there's a sense that it is normalizing the capture of territory. So that at a point, 10 years later, when there is an international arbitration, for example, like the one which Philippines launched, then the ground situation has changed. The more territory China captures, the more of a claim it has to the exclusive economic zone around the region. And it is this creep that is really worrying. It is this creep that is normalizing a new situation and changing the ground realities for tomorrow. Is that a major worry?
There are two or three aspects here. One is that yes, there is a broad global consensus that as far as the management of the ocean resources of the world are concerned, the 1982 UNCLOS or the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas, the principles that are derived from there, would be the larger framework in which the global community would try and address this particular complex issue of resources in the oceans and at the seabed. Now there's a paradox. The United States is not a signatory to the UNCLOS. But at the same time, it has said that it would abide by the principles in the spirit of UNCLOS and also respect what is called as customary law. UNCLOS is only of recent origin, meaning it's a late 20th century introduction. But there is 500 years of what you might call as customary law at sea, which has been derived from the European experience, and progressively, more and more regulatory issues have been brought on board. Now, in the South China Sea, what China is doing is to consolidate its position. It's using its tangible, comprehensive national power, its economic assets, financial assets, technological assets, and what it can bring to bear as far as its Navy and Coast Guard are concerned. And they are now investing in these artificial islands. They are trying to inhabit relatively uninhabited rocks and so on and so forth. But there is a legal point here, meaning that UNCLOS, if you read it very carefully, one of the principal, shall we say, elements or norms is that when you make a claim about the exclusive economic zone, there is a principle which says that from your coast, you can draw a line, hypothetically, that goes up to 200 nautical miles. And as long as there is no competing claim, that particular state or island can lay claim to that exclusive economic zone for mining, for using the resources, whether they are organic or non-organic. Now, what China is doing is to try, as I said, the 9-dash line that they are now saying is gospel, is being buttressed again by creating these artificial structures. But UNCLOS says that the EEZ would be related only to natural structures, not man-made structures. So when we say natural structure, it means the equivalent of the coastline of the nation or the island state in question, and the way in which you start measuring from the equivalent of the coral reef, wherever the natural structure ends. So now, interestingly, both Japan and China in their own way are trying to actually invest in coral to see if they can grow it, because it can be grown, and thereby extend their claim. I anticipate that this is going to be a very complex legal contestation about what are the principles and is there a spirit of the UNCLOS in relation to EEZ that is being violated. We'll come to that at some point if all parties agree to have a dialogue. But what is happening now in the SCS, and as I said, China-Japan is a different story, but that takes place in the East Sea. Here you have a situation where Philippines, for instance, has now contested the Chinese claim. They are taking it to international arbitration. The Chinese are very, very upset and cross. Countries like Vietnam are trying to deal with this tactically. Now China, I think, the Chinese attempt is to try and, in a way, create a certain, shall we say, division within ASEAN and see those countries that would, in a way, support the Chinese position. We already saw this in the summit in Cambodia. And try and deal with each country bilaterally. This is where the global community and India come into the picture, which is, at some point, so far, everyone is being very cautious. The Americans do not, should we stop? The Americans do not want to really, I think, be drawn into this at this stage, when they have many other issues where they are in some kind of contestation with the Chinese. They also need Chinese support on issues such as North Korea, Iran nuclear issue, what is happening in West Asia, Syria, etc. So we are in a position or in a situation of what could best be described as an uneasy kind of semi-peace is in place in the region, because the contestation is happening at the level of the navies and the Coast Guard. Ships are in proximity, sometimes they jostle each other, and there is even talk about structures that may have to be either physically protected and so on and so forth. So it's not the most desirable situation, which is why I said the waters are roiled. So I think, in summary, the Chinese attempt can be described as one of trying to consolidate its position as and when this moves to either international arbitration or some kind of maybe even a contestation short of military conflict. But clearly the tensions are building, and we have to see how the Philippines, how Vietnam and ASEAN as a collective is going to deal with Chinese creeping assertiveness.
We'll just take that last point again.
And where ASEAN as a collective would have to take some kind of a position about what I had earlier described as China's creeping assertiveness against the backdrop of an increasing trade, economic, fiscal dependency, because China has got fairly deep pockets. Now China is investing in this very ambitious, what they call as Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very ambitious, I would say, macro connectivity project that would seek to use both the maritime domain and land connectivity through China all the way up to Europe and come back, into the Indian Ocean on the western seaboard. So this is a very, very ambitious project, and we have to see whether or not China can realize it.
Well, you expressed a lot of belief in the ability for international arbitration and international law to solve the problem as opposed to a more political or military solution. And I certainly hope that you are right. But I want to use this to segue into the entire, you mentioned the maritime Silk Route and the Indian Ocean region. And the Indian Ocean region is a region in which Prime Minister Modi is also placing, investing a lot of his time and effort. He recently went on a trip to Mauritius, to Seychelles, Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, the Maldives trip got cancelled because of political developments in Maldives. But the Indian Ocean region is also another region of concern. We have various commentators who've expressed concern about Chinese submarines entering the region. There was a leaked defense report which stated that Chinese nuclear submarines were making frequent forays into the Indian Ocean, and this was even backed up by naval officers from the United States as well as intelligence officers from the United States. There have also been reports of Chinese vessels which were ostensibly there for piracy operation actually carrying out deep sea reconnaissance activities to study the undersea bed and to get a better understanding of the terrain. So is this a cause for concern as well, the growing Chinese influence and military presence in the Indian Ocean region, which is essentially India's backyard?
I'll just back up slightly and go back to that point about China and the possibility of a legal solution. I'm an analyst. So I'm just saying that the most desirable way of approaching this is to really stick with the dialogue and arrive at some accommodation. Because the moment you cross the median of conflict, I think it would become very, very complex and it would really rock the boat in a way that would not be prudent for all parties, including China, ASEAN, Japan, United States, and even India. So it's not that the Chinese are unaware of this. So you can see a kind of eyeball to eyeball to see who will blink first. And I think India has to look at that. So I just thought I'd clarify that my only sort of reason for flagging the legal or the political accommodation is, to me, that seems the most desirable. But as we know in international relations, there is a constant contrast that desirability and feasibility are inversely proportional. So I'll leave it at that. But specific to the Indian Ocean, yes, China is looking at the Indian Ocean in a very determined way. And again, as an analyst, I would say that there is an underpinning logic, meaning that if you look at 500 years of global history, there is one tenet that every major power, the world has only 3 navigable oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. Every major power, starting with Iberia, Portugal and Spain, in the high point of Iberian influence in the 16th, 17th centuries, they were really seeking to consolidate their presence in 2 of these oceans. In those days, it used to be the equivalent of the Atlantic, one part, the Mediterranean, and then the Indian Ocean. That's how the whole pattern of colonization starts. Later on, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, is able to consolidate the British presence, and you have a situation where the Indian Ocean, for instance, becomes the equivalent of a British lake, and the Americans and the British then have the equivalent of an Anglo-American alliance, and the baton passes from Britain to the United States. Cold War, at which time the Pacific and the Atlantic are the 2 most important maritime theaters. The Indian Ocean remains dominant. I would make the case that after the end of the Cold War, 1991, and more specifically 9/11, September 2001, the global maritime focus has shifted to what you might call as the Pacific-Indian Ocean combined, meaning the Asian part of the Pacific, the Western Pacific, through the Malaccas into the Indian Ocean up to the Straits of Hormuz. That in many ways is actually the strategic, if you ask me, sea route today. Now, it's differently described. Some commentators refer to this as the Indo-Pacific. One school of American analysts refer to this as the long littoral. But basically, you can see that the major powers, United States, China, India, Japan, differently, and the EU to an extent, are invested in this so-called, what I would call as the Indo-Pacific, from Japan all the way down the eastern seaboard of Asia, through the Malaccas, up to the Hormuz. So the reason why China is looking at the Indian Ocean in such a determined way is that it has constraints as far as the Pacific is concerned. I mean, if you look at China and its geography and the politics surrounding that geography, in a way it's boxed in. If you look at the Pacific front of China, there is Japan, there are the Koreas, there is ASEAN, there's Taiwan, and there's this great American presence. So the logical step for China is to look at the Indian Ocean. So there is a strategic interest, there is the equivalent of an economic interest, and a certain anxiety about energy. When President Hu Jintao was in the seat of power in Beijing, he introduced something called China's Malacca dilemma into the security discourse of China, saying that China had such a critical dependence for its energy needs through the sea lines, Indian Ocean, Malaccas, that there would always be this anxiety that in the event of an adversarial situation, a more capable nation or a coalition of nations could strangulate China at sea. So this is this very deep anxiety China has. So my point is that in the Indian Ocean today, China has a strategic interest which is derived from what I would call as one of the macro tenets of sea power and major states. And the second is more specific, which is what is happening in the Indian Ocean and the need for China to find a way out of the box where it is in relation to the Pacific. which is why China has invested over the last 30-40 years in a very interesting way. The first investment China makes is Pakistan. That goes back to the Cold War, the days of Mao, Nixon, all of that. Then you have China now investing in the South Asian littoral, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Chinese investments in the island states, particularly the Maldives, as also now they are looking at Seychelles, at a removed Madagascar. Now China is not looking only at the Indian Ocean islands. They also have a very visible presence now in the South Pacific islands. I, as an analyst, can see the logic that is driving them. But from the Indian point of view, increased Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, including the fact that submarines are now docking in Sri Lanka, does cause a certain degree of concern in India. Now, it's nobody's case that the Indian Ocean is India's ocean. Nobody in India has ever said that. But at the same time, India has interests. And that is where I think we are seeing this bumping, where Chinese influence in South Asia is progressively increasing, again because of China's deep pockets and the way in which China is able to provide incentives, trade, economic support, infrastructure, investment, financial support. And many of the smaller states have also become now, shall we say, fairly adept in maximizing their relations with both China and India to the extent possible. Sri Lanka is a classic example, where in the previous regime of President Rajapaksa, there was a very clear orientation of Colombo towards Beijing. Now the new regime is trying to review and provide a certain balance, but India would have to live with the fact that China is now present in the Indian Ocean. It came in formally at the end of 2008 when we had the piracy issue. From early 2009 to where we are now, early 2015, in the last 6 years, China has maintained a steady presence in the Indian Ocean based around a 3-ship task force. So they're there all the time. They now have option to find R&R repairs and whatever in Djibouti and certain parts of the Persian Gulf. They also have Sri Lanka, Colombo. And my sense is that apart from these countries, they would also invest in the Indian Ocean islands in a fairly definitive way. And this is again a classic case of trying to use politics to trump geography. The fact that you're boxed in the Pacific. What do? You try and come out, you leapfrog geography, and by investing in the islands in the Indian Ocean, or for that matter in Sri Lanka, you are able to use your political leverage to change geography in a manner that would favor your strategic initiatives.
I mean, yes, but my initial question was, at what point does it become a problem? I mean, you've done a brilliant job of explaining the strategic considerations which drives China's actions. You've explained to us why China is doing what it's doing, what are its objectives, what it aims to achieve, and the sort of straitjacket it finds itself in with respect to the naval theater, which is why it's doing a lot of what it's doing. But if we agree that the growing Chinese military presence in the region, a growing Chinese presence not just in the South China Sea but also in the Indian Ocean region is a problem, then at what point does India need to respond? Are there any clear red lines which India can draw, which clearly demarcate that a Chinese action which crosses that line will invite a more forceful Indian response? And by forceful, I don't necessarily mean military, but just more than, let's say, expressing concern or arguing for the principles of international law to be followed. Are there any red lines that we can draw?
Well, India, I think, has not come up with what you might call as an effective response. This has been animating the Indian political establishment and the strategic community since the end of the Cold War, from Prime Minister Narasimha Rao through Prime Minister Vajpayee to 10 years of the UPA to where we are now with Mr. Modi. And I think the reason why there is this concern, let me sort of maybe offer my perspective as an analyst. I'm sure the Indian political establishment and the Indian diplomatic community would have their own perspective. For me, the concern is that today, if you empirically review China's investment, political, economic, strategic, whatever, in South Asia, Pakistan offers a very interesting example where China has invested in Pakistan, in the Pakistani army, and that particular support of China to Pakistan, particularly in relation to nuclear weapons and missiles, what is called as WMD or weapons of mass destruction, has enabled Pakistan to act in a manner that has directly affected India's security. My sort of reduction is that China provided Pakistan nuclear weapons and missiles, May 1990. From then on, Pakistan uses this equivalent of a shield, the nuclear and missile shield, to enhance its capacity to inflict terrorism on India. It peaks in 2008 when Mumbai is attacked. So whenever we have had track 2 discussions with our Chinese colleagues and spoken about it, they keep saying that why is India so suspicious or not happy about China's profile in the region? And we bring up the Pakistan issue. Now, of course, they deny it. This is a Chinese characteristic that, what they do not want to confront, they do not accept. But when I look back as an analyst, my concern is that whether it's a Sri Lanka or a Bangladesh, not that these governments are unaware. I'm not suggesting that the Sri Lankan government, it's a very informed electorate, a very mature political establishment, that they would allow themselves to become subaltern players in the larger Chinese objective. I don't think that will happen. I mean, we saw Myanmar recently. For a long time, 10-15 years, there was a sense that Myanmar is increasingly moving into the Chinese orbit. But recently, over the last year, Myanmar, which is now making its own transition to democracy, has actually cancelled a major Chinese project for environmental reasons. There have been problems on the management of the ethnic groups. So much so that in a very rare instance, there has been the use of ordnance, and some Chinese nationals have also been either killed or injured. This is very rare. So what I'm suggesting is that China and the way in which it provides support to India's neighbors should not result in an exigency that is inimical to India. And this is something the Chinese are, I think, avoiding, to my mind. And therefore, we need to flag this particular issue when we talk to China, when Prime Minister Modi will be going there in May. And India is caught in the same dilemma that many major states are, that on one hand, you have to engage with China economically. You have to trade with them. We are hoping that the India-China trade would cross $100 billion, which is not insignificant from the Indian point of view. It may not be that large from the Chinese perspective. Now, when you're doing that, we also have to deal with our complex territorial and border dispute, which has not moved very much. We are looking at this Chinese support to Pakistan. And the fact that China still acts in a manner where the objective to me seems, and I want to use this phrase that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had once used, but it was quickly withdrawn, that China's objective seems to be to keep India on a permanent wobble and keep it boxed into South Asia. Now, the rhetoric is very persuasive. It's constantly about friendship with India. But the actions don't match. So, which is why, till such time as China walks the talk, as it were, we have to be cautious and constantly try to arrive at an informed assessment about how Chinese investment in the South Asian region are impacting India's national interests.
We're going to end part 1 of our interview with Commodore Bhaskar. We've been having a fascinating conversation talking about China and the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean region. Please do join us for the second part of this interview. Thank you.